We're just going to put YouTube on and then we can start.
That's great.
Good afternoon. My name is Gillian Balaban and I am Standards Assistant at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym, the GSSB, held on 10 December 2009. This virtual meeting is being hosted from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded, and you can find the audio recording on the GSSB website, along with high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Anna Krotova, Manager Standards, Bastian Buck, Chief of Standards, Helen Miller, Coordinator Governance Relations, Margarita Lysenkova, Manager Sector Program, Mia De Heidmar, Senior Manager Sector Program, and Sarah Jane Dominic, Senior Manager Standards. We will now start with a roll call. Corley LaRue.
Present.
Thank you. Evan Harvey.
Present.
Thank you. Gustavo Sinner.
I present.
Thank you. Jennifer Prinsing.
Present. Hello.
Hello. Kent Swift.
Present.
Michelle Vassar.
Present.
Peter Colley.
Present.
Ramakrishnan Venkateswaran. Welcome. Thank you, Rama. Robin Leeson.
Present.
Tung Lee Mo.
Present.
Vincent Hong.
Present.
GSSB Chair Judy Kuskewski.
I'm present. Thank you, Gillian.
Thank you, everyone. GSSB members Julia Wilson, Kirsten Marguerite Hovey, and Laura Dana Carter sent their apologies. I will now hand over to the Chair, Judy Kuskewski, to open the meeting.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for your time today. Apologies for the slightly late start today. We have a number of items on our public agenda, and I think I would like to first of all just do a quick overview of what's on our agenda for this meeting. First up, we have the approval of the GSSB summary from the 21st of November. I'm not aware of any comments or corrections that have been submitted by members, but we'll have a moment to look at that. We then have a short update from Anna on the GRI Waste Disclosures Review Project. There are no approvals relating to that, but that's an important update for us. And then we have a couple of things to review with respect to the oil, gas, and coal sector project. Those are for information and approval and discussion in one case. And finally, we have the project proposal for the development of a standard for the agriculture and fishing sector. And we have a couple of documents there. The project proposal is for approval. The terms of reference is for information. We then close the public meeting and have a private meeting thereafter. Can I start with, before we dive into the actual discussion documents, I'd just like to take a short moment to recognize the success that the Standards Division has had in the last week with the launch of the tax standard. It seems to have been received to a great deal of interest by different stakeholder groups. There was a successful launch event in New York the other day. There's been some high-level media coverage, which I know the GRI press office has been collecting the cuttings, and maybe I would just ask for a note to be taken that perhaps what we can do is share the collected cuttings with the GSSB members. I know that they have a collection of those, and I think people would be interested to review them if they haven't seen them already. But I wanted to just say thank you very much to the Standards Division team for the hard work that they put into that, and also into the launch itself, which does seem to have gone very well so far.
Thank you for this, Judy. Maybe just from our end, later in the week we will also provide an update on the media coverage and all of that to the GSB, like we've done. I think it was on Friday last week where there was a first email going out.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so the first substantial item on the agenda is to approve the summary of the GSSB meeting held on the 21st of November. As I said, I'm not aware of any corrections or additions or comments that GSSB members have submitted so far, but I would like, first of all, to just put it out to members. Does anyone have anything to add or to change or take away from this summary? Hearing none, I think we can agree that that has been passed as approved. Thank you very much for that. And we now have, thank you for responding, for your availability for the meetings next year. What you see ahead of you right now is the forthcoming calendar of meetings. We have reduced the in-person meetings to one next year, just based on the likely cycle of the work calendar, the work plan over the course of the year. But hopefully between the October meeting in person and the half dozen additional virtual meetings throughout the course of the year, we will nevertheless get everything done that we need to.
This is Bastian. Just to confirm that invites went out for all the meetings that you see here now, so they should be in your calendar. And we will add more information about the technology we use to dial in. As said last time when we spoke on the 21st of November, we're aiming to use Zoom going forward, and we will add that to the invites early next year.
Thank you. Okay, I'm then going to hand it over to Anna Krotova to tell us about the status of the GRI Waste Disclosures Review Project. There are no approvals relating to this, but this is an important update for us. Anna, please.
Thank you, Judy, and good afternoon, everyone. Indeed, this is just a status update at this point. And so to remind you where we are on the project timeline, we are right now at phase 5, which means that for the past 4 months, we've been reviewing the feedback and incorporating that together with the working group and the draft and evolving the draft. We have had 3 meetings with the project working group, and we have just completed a peer review yesterday, sending the latest recommendations of the project working group to a selected group of stakeholders, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But so where we've gotten to with the content of our draft, we're now looking at 5 disclosures in total. We're with 2 management approach disclosures, which really look at the context around how waste is created, where it's generated in the value chain, and then the approach of the reporting organization to manage the impacts on the waste. And then we have 3 topic-specific disclosures around the performance of waste performance of the organization, so supplying quantitative information. I will walk you now disclosure through disclosure to just give a little bit more update. So the first disclosure talks about the waste that was generated and the related significant waste-related impacts, and the purpose really is for a data user to understand how the organization has created the waste, what has led to waste generation, what has led or affected the quantity and the quality of the waste and the related impacts, and to understand where, importantly, in the value chain is waste generated. So whether it's just waste in the organization's own activities, but also it's waste related to its products or services that it supplies downstream that reach their end of life and become waste. One of the significant changes that we've made based on the public feedback is that we removed a requirement to report the process flow diagram, and it is now a recommendation, so reporters can still supply that information if they have it and if it's feasible. But we're really asking just for narrative descriptions of waste generated and the related impacts. We've also followed up on the feedback from stakeholders that they wanted more clarity for organizations to describe specifically if they generate waste in their own activities, but also upstream and downstream, and so that is now formulated a little bit more clear. The next disclosure asks about the organization's approach to manage the waste and the related significant impacts, and here we are asking specifically whether the organization considers itself to be responsible for any waste that it has generated outside of its own activity, so the direct waste versus the direct waste, and a question to understand how the organization manages these significant waste-related impacts. So these are follow-on questions around the goals and targets, about the data monitoring systems that they have, and this is also importantly one of the bigger entry points to report on circularity measures and circular economy in general, and how they're using that to prevent waste generation. One important change that we made here is that we've moved a disclosure that used to sit in a topic-specific section to this section because it was really asking more for narrative information. And that disclosure related to a company's understanding of what actually happens in practice to its waste once it leaves the reporting organization's boundary and how it's treated by a third party elsewhere. And so then that brings us to 3 topic-specific disclosures. And so the first one is on waste generation, and this is a new disclosure compared to the exposure draft. And really what it's trying to cover is to understand the difference between total waste that is generated and the volume of total waste that is generated and the volume of total waste managed, because there can be a difference, and it's important to cover because sometimes that difference can signal any waste that is being managed in an uncontrolled manner. So any waste that goes to open dumps or open or is burned in the open, often organizations we've seen do not actually acknowledge those numbers when they report the totals of their waste managed. And so seeing that through waste generation and through the difference with waste generation is the only way to capture that. The next disclosure, the next 2 disclosure, in fact, used to be one. They used to be it used to be disclosure on waste that was managed, but here we've revised the structure of that disclosure, following on one probably of the most significant points from the public feedback was that we should be really separating the more positive or more preferable interventions or operations in the waste management hierarchy, so prevention, reuse, and recycling and other recovery, from the least preferable waste disposal operations, which is incineration and landfilling. And by having sort of lumped that all together in one disclosure, we're really losing that essential notion that we're trying to bring and the concept that waste can be used as a resource, and that all options to send it to disposal should be avoided as much as possible ahead of that. And still this information, this disclosure requires to report waste for both, or information for both hazardous and non-hazardous waste, so that distinction is still there. And we have also simplified slightly a requirement to report on-site and off-site information. So we're not requiring anymore to report the distinction of who specifically managed the waste, but rather whether it left the organization's gate or not. And then the third disclosure here is really just waste disposal, and that is to understand really the total amount of waste that is being sent to this least preferable waste management option, and then the specific types within that waste is being managed, the specific types of operation that waste is being managed by. And similarly, again, here we just mirrored all the changes that we made in the previous disclosure, where we're asking less information about on-site and off-site, and we're also requiring waste disposal to be reported for both hazardous and non-hazardous waste. So this brings us to the timeline and the next steps for us left in this year. So we're really looking at now sending the draft through sort of an editorial review, where we're really looking to make sure that everything is consistent and clear and correct. And the draft will still go to the project working group for their one last review and sign off over the Christmas break. And then we'll have one last call with them in January, which will be an approval and a sign off call, but also an opportunity to still resolve any closed issues. And then we're looking at submitting the draft to the GSSB in February ahead of your meeting in March. If approval is granted during the March meeting, we'll be looking at submitting the due process adherence report to the due process oversight committee shortly after that, maybe not as soon as shown on the timeline. And then we'll be looking at rollout activities, but this is probably a little bit preliminary at this stage. So this was a very short update to give you also some time back. Any questions at this stage?
Anna, thank you very much for that overview. I don't see any questions right now, but I would just like to flag that we're looking at the timeline here, and of course, we don't have very much time between now and the expected submission back to the GSSB of the finalized draft standard, which would be in February of 2020. I think it's just most important for us as the GSSB right now to make sure that there isn't a need to re-expose the draft at any point between now and then. So if I just put that to the group now, if anyone has any concerns that would rise to that level in particular, I would very much appreciate it if you would flag those now.
Sorry, Junie, may I just respond to that actually, because you reminded me of a point I wanted to make. So I mentioned in the beginning that we have closed off a peer review yesterday, and that was a peer review with a selected group of stakeholders. So those who have provided comments to during the first public comment, and we've selected these experts based on the quality of their feedback first time around, as well as the diversity of their diversity of constituency representation. And so this was a small group of 7 or 8 peer reviewers, and they have all largely come back with feedback that they didn't see, that they validated all of the new changes that we have put in front of them, and also acknowledging that we have resolved sort of the key concerns that they've had during the first public comment. So just to say that there has been an external check, I suppose, of this content conducted.
That's great. Thank you very much. Kent, you would like to make a point.
Yeah, I wanted to know whether there are any significant issues among the members of the working group. That is, at this point, is everybody pretty much in agreement, or are there likely to be significant issues that might come up in the future?
Anna, can you respond to that?
Yes, not to my knowledge. No, we have a bit of a back and forth with the group around the waste management method. So whether we, consider incineration, whether we consider energy recovery as other recovery and therefore a sort of a positive interventions, or whether we really look at it as a consequence of incineration, which is a very negative practice because you're really destroying the materials through incineration, irrespective of whether you then have a beneficial sort of or positive secondary consequence. But that's a minor, I suppose, technical sort of debate or issue that they've had, but nothing significant at this point to my mind that I would still see them dispute.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Kent. Any other questions for Anna?
It's Michel here. It's just to add another comment, since I was the GSSB sponsor of that work group. In my opinion, there has been a good consensus among members of the working group already when we presented to the GSSB the first time, which was back in June, if I remember correctly. Most of the comments which have been received, practically all the comments we have been received since, were more about clarification of what was requested. None of them were really questioning what has been put in the draft as it was first presented for public comments. Discussions since have been mostly on vocabulary to use and technicalities, but I haven't seen any strong differences. Remember when I presented to you, I said during the first meeting, I thought it would be very difficult because everybody was discussing with each other. And after the first face-to-face meeting, I saw an excellent collaboration between the different members of the working group, and I didn't see any, let's say, outstanding discussions or divergence in opinion. It was more technicalities on vocabulary.
Very good to hear. Thank you very much for that, Michel. Any other thoughts from the GSSB members? Okay, well, if there aren't any, then I would just like to say thank you very much for that update, Anna. Thanks for your efforts on that. Thank you, Michel, also on behalf of the GSSB for representing us well in this working group. And we look forward to receiving the finalized standard for approval in due course in the early part of 2020. Okay, can I turn it now to Mia to talk us through, we have a couple of different updates and documents with respect to the oil, gas and coal sector standard project. Please go ahead, Mia.
Thank you very much, Judy, and thank you for having me in the meeting today. So yes, I will be relatively quick. We have a approval for the GSSB to have a temporary replacement of a project working group member. So in light of the fact that we needed to put that up for decision today, I thought it was an opportunity to provide a little bit of an overview of where the oil, gas and coal project is, considering that we haven't provided an update on the sector program for a number of months. So if I just turn to progress so far, we're really in a state where we've got some good momentum around this project. The project working group has had 3 meetings now, which had included the 2-day in-person meeting in Amsterdam in the first half of October. They have also been engaged extensively via written tools such as a scoping survey and providing written feedback on topic descriptions. And up until this point, the focus has really been on identifying and describing the sector's impacts, significant impacts, and stakeholder concerns. And the project working group has validated around about 20 topics, I think it's 21 at the moment, that they feel are likely to be material for most reporting organisations in the oil, gas and coal sector. And of course they have flagged throughout the whole process that climate change is the most material issue for this sector and therefore needs to be prominently reflected in the sector standard. But we are coming close to understanding how each of these topics and impacts should be described. Of course, being a pilot project, we have faced some challenges with the group around the purpose of the standard, but also the structure and elements of the standard, so how each of these topic descriptions should be framed. And of course, one of the things that has generated a lot of discussion up until this point is what the sector standard should contain in terms of reporting advice. And we're very much continuing to work on how to broach reporting in the sector standard. It will look substantially different to G4 sector standards. So we've really been working hard as a team to put something forward that is both useful for reporting organisations in terms of using the GRI standards generally, but does not create a new ecosystem of reporting off to the side of those standards. So that's a little bit about where we are at to this point, but in terms of what comes next, our short-term milestones really are focused on circulating the first draft of a full sector standard to the project working group. There will, of course, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, be many holes, gaps and questions within that first draft, but it will also be the first time that we've put all of this content together as a pilot project. So we'll also be doing a lot of circulating of that internally, and we will circulate that to the GSSB subcommittee as well. But up until this point, the project working group has really only seen sections of what the standard might look like. We'll then move to discuss their feedback on that first draft at our 4th meeting, which is scheduled for late January. Because of the time zones and the geographic diversity of our group, we actually have to hold 2 working group meetings every time we meet. There's just no single hour where the whole group can meet, unfortunately. And if this goes to plan, then current scheduling shows the submission of an exposure draft to the GSSB for consideration is likely to be March or April, but I would say more erring towards April. Of course, we are also keeping an eye as we develop this content and the structure on what is happening in the Universal project to see where those intersections are and how we might be affecting each other. So now just to move to the project working group and a bit of an update on the working group. There's a few status updates to report. One member is going on maternity leave, and so we're requesting approval for a temporary replacement, and that's what we'll do on the next slide. But we have also had a couple of members who have not been engaged in the process actively. So one of those was a Labor representative, but we have recently had revived contact with her, so she will remain part of the group. But Liam McHugh from the World Coal Association has been largely disengaged from the project. We have recently asked him to confirm his membership as part of the project working group. He has not responded to that request so far. But if he continues to not participate in the working group process, then we will need to consider how we fill some of the knowledge gaps in relation to coal in particular. And we would come back to you with an update on that. Okay, so if I move to the decision, so as I mentioned, we have one member, Rebecca Collicott from IPECA, who has informed us that she is going on maternity leave. IPECA's involvement is considered particularly important for the success of delivery and adoption of this first sector standard. Of course, they are the peak body for oil and gas organisations. So we think that there is value in finding a replacement from IPECA. And the recommendation from IPECA has been that Helen Murphy, who is a Senior Manager of Social Responsibility and Supply Chain, would be in a position to cover Rebecca's role. Helen has 9 years of experience in the sustainability field and focused on developing and promoting good practice and knowledge to help the oil and gas industry improve its environmental and social performance. She covers topics including social performance, human rights, local content and supply chain management. And this portfolio is reasonably similar to what Rebecca also has. Helen has already had some engagement in the project to date. She actually covered a little bit of time for Rebecca, participated in our in-person meeting, and has also been engaged in some of our one-on-one conversations with Rebecca. So she has a very good up-to-date knowledge of the status of the project and how decisions have been made up until this point. Rebecca has asked to return to the group if it's still ongoing when she returns from maternity leave and if it makes sense. Excuse me. While I'm having a coughing fit, I might just ask Bastian to do the decision component of this replacement.
Yes, so we've outlined the decision that we asked you to take in item 3, and it is similar to earlier approvals that you have given to replace a member. In this particular instance, is a temporary replacement. So the question, well, first of all, maybe the question whether there is any further explanation needed at this stage. If not, I would ask Judy to ask the GSB to approve this.
Yeah. Any discussion or questions from members?
No.
I'm not hearing any. I think this is quite a just for the members' information. I happen to know both Rebecca and Helen pretty well, and this substitution makes perfect sense to me. So unless there are any other discussion points with respect to this one, Bastian, it sounds like we have consensus to approve that. replacement of membership temporarily.
Thank you, Judy.
Sorry
Okay.
about that.
Are you okay now? Yeah.
See how I go. I've got a
Right.
small end of year flu, but I'm
Aw.
going to be fine. We've just got one more slide actually, and this is related to item 2 in your pre-read. So since we spoke to you in September, we've received 2 additional stakeholder submissions from petroleum companies flagging their concern about the grouping of oil, gas and coal in the same sector standard. These 2 letters are aligned with the letter we previously received from IPECA, and both reference that issue being raised by IPECA. We've also included in item 2 our responses. I think our position has not changed from the discussion in September, so we, at this point, propose that we continue on with the scope as it is. There's underlying reasons for that scope, which we've discussed previously, but there will be a point in time, of course, when we need to just bring this back to the GSSB, and perhaps that's in connection to the submission of the exposure draft, or slightly in advance of that, we can have another discussion. But at this stage, we don't see that these submissions create a need to break oil and gas and coal into separate projects.
Thank you, Mia. Is there any discussion of this? As Mia said, the content of these submissions is very similar in nature to the one that we received from IPECA as an organization recently, which we shared with you previously, and the view that we have taken for the time being is that we will simply keep this under advisement for the coming months and see how it develops. But obviously, we will need to be open to taking a view more definitively on this in the coming months, depending on the actual progress of the project. Do we have any questions or comments from GSSB members about this? There's no decision here to be made. Just to be clear, we're simply advising you as to the communications that we've received from stakeholders on this topic, and we'll come back to this if a decision is required at the appropriate time. But does anyone have? Yes, Robin, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Judy. I was just wondering if it's appropriate to just ask from the Standards Division the perception of the work being done so far. If when the draft comes back to the GSSB, how is it being developed in a way that would be problematic to split coal out later, or I'm just wondering if the feedback we're getting from those significant stakeholders means that we're sort of being mindful of that as the work is continuing, or are there strong sort of processes and structures within the sector work that might make it just too problematic to do subsequently?
I think that's a good point, Robin. Mia, have you gotten to a stage in the development where it's possible to take a view on that yet?
Yeah, well, I think I can definitely provide a response to Robin's question. So essentially, what we're seeing is that the impacts that have been identified, so which have been sort of grouped into topics, the way we're familiar with in the GRI standards, are common. So there's no particular topic that's been identified as only relevant to oil and gas or only relevant to coal. However, where the difference is sometimes in the source of the impact, or perhaps the specific activity that's occurring in oil and gas. Of course, oil and gas also have this same sort of difference in some cases. But what we have done as a principle is in developing the underlying content, it was very clearly divided into oil and gas and coal in terms of how the impact occurs, so the source of the impact. And actually, in the first draft, it largely has a similar sort of principle applied to it. So you'll see the description of the impact is holistic, but then the way that it occurs might be separated out where it's different. So I don't think there's anything that would prevent us from breaking this up at a future point. And doing it that way also gives us a nice opportunity to really be quite clear about where the commonality is or where the difference is. Does that answer your question, Robin?
Yes, that's good. Thank you. Thanks, Mayor.
Peter, you have a question, please.
Yes, thank you. Pardon me. I did raise in early GSSB meetings that the grouping was going to be considered novel by some, and that particularly the industry itself, and that does seem to be what we're seeing. But I should also point out that with respect to Shell, it has actually in the past been a major coal producer, and Eni has also got a subsidiary called RGIP, which was a major coal producer as well at one point, not now. But the idea that these industries are totally separate and always have been is not correct.
Thanks, Peter. I think you've all received the letters themselves, the stakeholder submissions themselves that have been received. So you can all as members judge for yourselves what the nature of the comments are, and I think it's our responsibility to consider them on their merits and also to review those concerns in the light of the actual content of the emerging standard that is being that's being drafted at the moment. But my reading of these comments, Peter, is exactly that is the issue that's being raised, is simply the merits of combining all of these different activities together in a single standard, rather than the kind of specific technical differences between one thing and another that would actually influence some of the specific contents of the emerging standard. But as I said, it is still early enough in the process that we could change our view on that. Any other comments or questions? Okay, Mia, thank you very much for that update. Is there anything else that you'd like to put to the GSSB at this point?
No, that's all at this point.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Judy.
Thanks a lot, Mia. And that brings us now to Margarita, who's going to present for us the project proposal for the agriculture and fishing sector proposed standard and the terms of reference. As I said, the project proposal requires the approval of GSSB. The terms of reference, for the time being, this is just for information. Margarita, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. So we're glad to reintroduce the project proposal for an agriculture and fishing sector standard for approval. This sector project was identified as a second sector program pilot project. Similarly to the oil, gas, and coal sector, agriculture and fishing is a high-impact sector with a large number of documented impacts and also pressing issues that get currently a lot of attention from the international community. So here you can see a bit of history of the project proposal development. It was discussed by the GSSB in the beginning of the year. Then it was subsequently circulated to the GRI board and stakeholder council. In response to the stakeholder council feedback, whether the standard should include fishing and have a different title to reflect this, we have adjusted the name of the project to reflect the inclusion of fishing. So agriculture and fishing sector standard. It's important to know indeed that fishing was included in the scope of the sector standard proposal from inception. And when considering differences between agriculture and fishing activities, we found that any issue of alignment between the two appears to be primarily confined to the environmental impacts and the sources of the impact. Then we also explored the option to expand the scope of the sector standard to cover the full food value chain. We considered this option carefully, and we concluded that there was also high risk to drift towards food retail and consumption activities of the food value chain, as well as that agricultural products are an input to a number of other sectors. The upstream focus of the sector this way will allow us to direct reporters in downstream sectors, such as food processing and textile, for example, to this standard when reporting on the upstream impacts. So this brings us to the sector keys and the sector scope description. Previously, non-food agricultural activities such as growing of cotton and tobacco were excluded from the sector keys. However, we had a note in the proposal on applicability of the standard to non-food sectors. So we have adjusted that to make it clearer. The size of non-food related agricultural activities is also relatively small compared to food related agriculture. So now they are part of the sector keys. So we removed basically the note on exclusion. On the timeline, you have the detailed timeline in the proposal. Considering that we haven't yet finished the first pilot project, and we also discovered that additional time is needed to take decisions on the format of the standard, this is an indicative timeline. So if the project is approved, we expect to start recruiting the project working group late January and to have the in-person meeting in early July. So we have a detailed schedule in the document. And with this, I conclude. And we ask that GSSB does it approve the item 4 project proposal for an agriculture and fishing sector standard.
Thank you very much, Margarita. I'll open it to GSSB members for discussion. Kent, please.
I'm just trying to make sure I understand it. I don't have an opinion about this, but this sector standard would include aggregators, and I guess I have two questions about that. Is that clearly defined? You know what that term aggregation means in this context, and why have we decided to include them? They're not actual producers, and so I just would like a little bit more information about that.
Yes, so both production and aggregation activities are in scope. And basically, we use these terms also as a proxy to describe the activities of reporters for who this sector standard is destined. So production, basically agricultural companies that actually do growing of crops and raise livestock for consumption and also conduct fishing activities. These companies are in scope. And we also included aggregators, so by aggregators, we refer to all companies who purchase from farmers and then further resell. For example, we think of such companies as Cargill and others who are active in this space who are suppliers to food processors then.
I guess my question is Cargill in some way fundamentally different from the producers? I mean, why did we make the cutoff after the aggregation? And I'm just wondering about it.
Well, the value chain, so when we explored the value chain, so we looked at the food value chain as a proxy. And in that value chain, typically, for example, such an organization as FAO, they distinguish these activities. So the food value chain starts with production, then it's aggregation, then it's food processing, then it's consumption. So we refer to it this way to explicitly show that processing is not in scope.
Sorry, this is Mia speaking. I think just to add to that, we see this as, in a way, the mechanism by which agricultural products get from the primary producer to the next sort of sector, so to the processing. So, for example, in agriculture, you'll see a lot of co-ops or types of structures that essentially collect the product, I suppose, for sale from smaller producers. And so it makes more sense when we looked along the value chain for those types of organisations to be included with the production rather than with the processing. And that would be sort of the general driver.
Mia, is it true to say that the other? I mean, you did mention the FAO, for example, Margarita, in your remarks a moment ago. Do those types of organizations take this view that the aggregation sort of lives with the agriculture activity, the production activity, rather than with the processing activity?
Well, I'll just make a few comments and then I'll see if Margarita has anything to add. To be honest, we found so when we look at FAO, for example, and when we looked at a lot of organisations who were operating and looking at the impacts of agriculture, one of the challenges that we face is that a lot of these organisations are looking along the full value stream. So when you look at the way they articulate impacts, they're articulating things such as the impacts of nutrition or waste of, food waste. And so it's basically from beginning to end. But because of the structure of the sector standards with this movement from upstream to downstream, that would have been quite a step out from the way the program has been designed. And it also would have left us in a position when we move to, say, the sector of, say, textiles and apparel, there would have been a gap in the upstream potentially for that sector. We would have had to cover essentially the full value chain again. So there was and that was why we spent some time looking at whether or not there was any value in extending the scope of this sector across the full value chain. So I think, yes, there is essentially a line that's been drawn where it was basically the activities prior to when these things started to be, I suppose it was food processing, or where it started to be turned into another product. And that was part of the rationale. I don't think we've found anything, and maybe I look to Margarita here who has done this work, but I don't think we've found anything that pulls aggregation out as a separate item to be looked at. It's either part of a full value chain or it's associated with production, getting the production or the raw produce through to those who are doing the processing. So I think with these things there is a little bit of an arbitrary line that we have to draw, but that was the rationale, that there was a stronger link. And then the next wave of sector standards would pick up on when that product has essentially arrived for processing or manufacture.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for that. Robin, you are raising your hand. Please go ahead.
Yes. Thanks for the clarification on that. I just wanted to add, in terms of some clarity, about what constitutes an aggregator. I understand the definition as you've described it there. I think there are other frameworks in the agriculture sector that use the term aggregator in a different way, and it might be as an aggregator just of data and information. So for sort of national industry bodies, perhaps related to a particular agriculture sector, there might be sustainability information or KPIs or data or other sort of reporting that is collected and disclosed at a sort of a national level by a peak industry body, and they describe that as being sort of an aggregator as part of a global framework. So that's just something to be aware of. We don't have to necessarily mimic that, but as long as we're clear in this particular piece of work of what we mean by aggregation, I think that would be really helpful.
Thank you for that comment, Robin. I think that's a very good point, and I think we should absolutely make it clear that it's really about aggregating the product for the purposes of moving it through the value chain. So we can certainly add a note about that.
Okay, so is that an edit that you would plan to make to the project proposal then, Mia?
Sorry.
Or is
if that was acceptable to the GSSB, because it sounds like there maybe needs to be a little bit more clarity around what we mean by aggregation. If it was acceptable to the GSSB, we would propose to add an additional sentence or footnote that makes this very clear.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'll just put that back to the GSSB just to ensure that members are comfortable with that, or for that matter, if members feel it does not require any specific edit in the project proposal itself, but rather is something that can be managed in the course of the project execution, then that would also be good to know. But I'll just make sure that people are comfortable with that either one way or the other. So let's say first of all, if in fact, Mia, you would propose to put a short explanation in the project proposal, are members nevertheless comfortable to go ahead with this project proposal pending that addition being made? I'll ask that question. Any objections to that or concerns?
This is Kent. I don't know that we need to make any particular change to the proposal as is. I think that, as they work on this, we'll just, within whatever document gets developed, it'll be important to define what aggregation means to make sure that we have a good cutoff as to who's included in this sector. And so I think a little bit more definition will be important. I Googled, agricultural aggregation last night, and I came up with all kinds of different things that it might mean. So I'm not proposing that we change this document at all, but I think that, again, as the working group works on this, they'll just have to make sure that they're careful with the definition.
Thanks, Kent. Any other discussion of this?
Yeah, it's just Robin. Yeah, I'm comfortable with that as well. I think that can unfold during the course of the work itself.
Great. Any other members would like to weigh in on this? Okay, so Margarita and Mia and other colleagues on the standards division, I think you can take that as the advice of the GSSB going forward, and we'll probably have some further discussion of this as the project unfolds. And for the time being, unless there are other questions that members would like to raise at the moment, I'll put it back to the members to consider your approval of this project proposal. I am not seeing or hearing any further questions or objections, so we can assume that we have achieved consensus on this, and this has been approved for use at the moment. Okay. Thank you very much then to colleagues on the standards division. I believe this then, if I'm not mistaken, brings us to the close of the public meeting. Is that correct?
We have one more quick mentioning of the terms of reference.
Terms of reference. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, this document is presented for discussion. There are no changes to the terms of reference, so it's prepared based on the template that we developed for the oil, gas, and coal project. A more important question to us is, does the GSSB have recommendations for the participation of specific organizations?
And this, Bastian, I think these can be sent through after the call as well. We have done some research, so this is an FYI at this stage. But if you have any pointers as to changes of the terms of reference or further clarifications in the terms of reference, or for that matter, organizations that we should involve in teeing up the recruitment of this group, you can let us know.
Any immediate questions or comments from the GSSB? Okay. Thanks very much for that, and please, yes, if you do have any advice for the standards division, as Bastian has requested, please contact them directly. Okay. Thank Thank you. So that concludes the content of the public meeting, and I thank the GSSB members for their time and their attention to these issues. We have a short private meeting, and just for the record, obviously we have another. We have forthcoming meetings that have already been gone through earlier in today's agenda, and we have another meeting on Thursday, which I believe is entirely for information only. Am I wrong about that, Bastian? Is there a public portion of the meeting on Thursday?
No, this is a private meeting.
It's entirely information only. Yeah.
The next public meeting is currently scheduled
February.
for February, and this is just so the 6th of February at 1 p.m. Amsterdam time.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. And this now concludes the public meeting, and we can close that out.